He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. Some received him, some rejected him, but none dissuaded him from his mission, to rescue us from sin and repair our relationship with God so that we could play a part in his good plan to restore the world. Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. Jesus made God known to us. That's why his life is so important. That's why his life is light to all mankind. Jesus illuminated the character and nature of God in everything he did and everything he said. He didn't rush to the cross. The Word walked deliberately through life, down to his last week, and was a lamp for our feet and a light for our path.
Our message tonight is taken from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, Behold, he is calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion, who stood facing him, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, Truly, this man was the Son of God. So all four gospel writers are at pains, actually, to show that the events of Jesus' death were all held in the dark. In the Gospel of John, for instance, on the night when Jesus would be betrayed and Judas has made the fatal decision of his life to betray Jesus, John's next line is, and it was night. Kind of dramatically saying, darkness had taken over Judas. In the garden, his betrayal, and the trials that were held by the Sanhedrin against the law they said they were upholding were done at night. Done at night. And now at the moment of his crucifixion, from the 3rd hour to the 6th hour, that is from 12 noon till 3 in the afternoon, darkness. Now some people think, oh, well, it could have been, maybe it was an eclipse, but do you realize a couple of things? Eclipses don't last 3 hours, and Passover is held at full moon, and you can't have an eclipse with a full moon. And then others have said maybe it was a haboob, that is a dust storm that they can get in the Middle East, except that Passover's in the spring, and it's the wet season in Israel at that time. No, it seems that what happened that day was much more supernatural than natural. The darkness really epitomized everything that was going on in this world at the time. This is a supernatural darkness. And so the question at that time is why? And what does this all mean? As we've read in the Gospel of John tonight or heard, the light shines in the darkness and was not overcome. So this night we're going to look on Good Friday at these 3 points. The darkness that we actually have that inhabits us, the darkness Jesus received for us, and how Jesus' darkness can dispel ours. So the darkness that we have, so physical darkness is often used as a metaphor in the Bible for something much deeper, for spiritual darkness. In fact, Jesus says it himself. In Luke chapter 22, when he is in the Garden of Gethsemane and the soldiers from the Sanhedrin come, and the chief priests, it says it this way in 52 to 53, then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officer of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me then, right? But this is the hour and the power of darkness. And there is something to be said. We know this in our day and age. Darkness is a great cover for a lot of negative activities, a lot of things we try to hide. And here Jesus is saying it's a metaphor for what this world was facing at that time and what he faced himself. Darkness is a great metaphor for our human condition. Ernest Shackleton, any of you ever hear of him? Otto does, of course. He knows all this trivia. Ernest Shackleton was one of the great explorers of the heroic age of exploration, especially for Antarctica. And his ship, on one of his 3 journeys, called the Endurance, did not endure. It got trapped in the ice and finally sank in the Weddell Sea off of Antarctica on November 21st, 1915. The crew escaped by camping on the sea until that ice started to disintegrate, and then they launched lifeboats to reach Elephant Island and ultimately South Atlantic island of South Georgia. They actually made it all the way, all safe. But the worst was not the ice. The worst was not the sea. The worst, they said, was the darkness. One biographer of this polar explorer put it this way: in all the world, there is no desolation more complete than the polar night. Only those who have experienced it can fully appreciate what it means to be without the sun day after day and week after week. Few unaccustomed to it can fight off its effects altogether, and it has driven some men mad. That's what we're talking about. That's inside of us, Jesus would say, the Gospels would say. And in darkness, I don't know if you've ever gone to one of those cave tours, and you get down in that cave and they decide to turn off all the lights. It's the only time, I think, in our society that we actually experience that. In fact, when we, even at night, there's lights everywhere, right? Maybe during a hurricane sadly, after the electricity is out, we can experience a little of what it's like to be in the dark. But even then, we have flashlights. Even then, we have other means of seeing. But when you're in a cave, in the middle of the earth, in complete darkness, it's amazing. You can't see an inch in front of your face. You can't see yourself. You can't see anyone else. You don't know where you are. And that's just for a few moments. They don't keep them off for long. Can you imagine? You know, the Bible also talks in some metaphor about God being kind of like the sun. We don't worship the sun. That's not the metaphor there. But how the sun gives light and life to the world. Without sunlight, all biological life on this planet would be extinct in a very short time. And because of the sun, we can see everything else. And that way, the Bible is saying God is like that. Through God and His light, His truth, we can see everything else, including ourselves. If you orbit your life around God, the Bible will argue, then your life has vitality and truth. But if you turn yourself away from God and orbit around anything else, as if that were your source of light and life, your career, your relationships, your family, spiritual darkness. If anything is more important for you, then you have a problem with where you're going in life. It's impossible to discern, actually, where you're going. You don't even know how to make plans. Money, career, love, For a period of time, you might feel like this is a great purpose and a great direction, but only to find out it's going to lead to spiritual darkness. But if you center on God, then even when you feel fragile, your identity is secure. In spiritual darkness, you can be isolated. You can find yourself kind of like in a cave, filling yourself with self-pity, scared, angry, proud, driven by all sorts of wild and crazy emotions. And that is our problem. That is where we are. And I think we're seeing a little more of what spiritual darkness is like when we look around in our culture and society today. People seem to have turned away in one form or another. They found a different center to orbit their lives around. They seem lost and confused and anxious, filled with self-pity, scared, angry, and divisive at the same time. If you go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, where it all starts, where John's gospel actually takes us back when it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God," it reminds us of Genesis 1:1 that says much the same. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then it says this, "The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep." At the beginning, that is when the light, God says, "Let there be light." It pierces the darkness, the chaos of the chaos waters, whatever those were. That's the description that Genesis has for what was before, which was nothing. It's a way of saying empty, formless, void. That's where things head when they end up going into the darkness. When darkness appears time and again in the biblical narrative, it represents how things are moving to uncreation, to chaos, to falling apart, to death and destruction. For example, I don't know if you realize that the 10 plagues in Egypt were about chaos, darkness, uncreation, the whole of society falling apart, nature out of balance, out of whack, darkness itself when the sun was covered. And when Jesus performs miracles in the New Testament, they're not simply about, look at me, look at what I can do. They're not proofs of his divinities. They are actually purposefully done to show order over chaos in nature, calming storms, as well as healing and bringing wholeness, bring creation back to the way it should be. And they all point to what God wants to do for the entire cosmos one day. So, darkness, it's what we've got. God doesn't leave us in it. Instead, Jesus comes into the midst of darkness. From the 3rd to the 9th hour, he faces it. Every bit of chaos, every bit of evil, every bit of the powers of darkness fall on him during that period of time. He's abandoned by his friends. He is cursed by the crowds. He is betrayed by those closest to him. He is humiliated and judged by the religious people of his day, and he's crushed by the governing authorities. Everybody turns away from him, and Jesus cries out, as this text says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He didn't cry out, "Oh, my friends, where have you gone?" That was painful, but that wasn't the worst of it. Nor did he cry out, my head, my hands, oh, my body aches." The physical torture is not the center of the story. No, it is the fact that he is now in the darkness, without the light and love of his own Father. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus faces that darkness. The creator of the world is being uncreated on the cross. All is lost for him, and the light of the world is engulfed in it. He dies. He really dies. Now, I had a student this last week. It just so happened that this week in World Religions, we started on Christianity. And we just kind of go through the basics of the faith, talking about who Jesus is, what he did, why he died on the cross, why he rose again. And one of the students in the class asked a very profound question in one sense, because it's a question he has over the whole thing. And it's one that many people in this world have had. And that is, why in the world would you believe that God would require his son to be sacrificed and to pour out his blood and be tortured in order to forgive people their sins? Why doesn't God just forgive people their sins? Why do they go through all of that to do it? Can't he just do it because he's God? And it's a deeply profound question. And so this last Thursday, both Aaron and Jaden and a few other of our students got together and we did a podcast on just that topic as well. We know that forgiveness is not as easy as people think it is, even for God. I know that sounds odd. Well, God can do anything. He doesn't go against his own nature, though. God can do anything, but he doesn't do things that are unrighteous. God can do anything, but he doesn't go against his standards he sets up. He has got to be consistent with himself. That's one thing that God has to be. And being righteous and being true and being loving puts God, in a sense, in a predicament when it comes to human beings. He is, and you can see it through the Hebrew scriptures all the way along, he is at agony over what's happening in this world. Throughout time, he is suffering. And here's an example that I used in class. I don't know if it answered the student fully. Thankfully, we're on Christianity again next week on Monday. We'll continue. But I said, suppose I go over to somebody's house for dinner and I happen to accidentally, but not on purpose, it's still bad enough if it's accidentally, break a precious vase in their house, and it happened to also be an heirloom from their great-grandparents. Okay? Something so precious and valuable. If it went to the Antique Roadshow, it'd make maybe $100,000, okay? So we're not talking just about anything. It's something really precious. And I break it, and it shatters to 1,000 pieces. And I say, oh, I'm so sorry. And my hosts are so gracious. They say, oh, don't worry. It's covered. Is it covered? Somebody's paying a cost for me doing that. Now, they're paying the cost if I go out and try to buy and replace that vase, even if I can find a duplicate of it, it's not from their great-grandparents anymore. It's not quite the same. But if I could do that, then I'm paying the cost, at least partially for it. But if they say, no, don't worry about it, and they go out and buy the vase to replace it, it's also a cost to them. But likely, in something like that, they can't even find anything like that. And instead, what happens? They have paid a price. They don't have that object any longer. There is no such thing as forgiveness without a cost. Emil Brunner, I think, put it pretty well, and I'm hoping to use something like this quote. He is a theologian that, some theologians don't know how to speak plainly. Have you ever read this? Yeah. Well, he's kind of in between here. But he said this: the more realistic we are, the more knowledge of guilt we possess. That is, the more we realize the darkness we've got. The more real man becomes, the more acknowledge himself to be guilty. The more clearly we see that fellowship with God is not something which can be taken completely for granted, the more we see that it is costly. And the cost is not paid by man. For how can sinful man himself undertake to bear the cost of restoring the conditions of fellowship? Thus, the restoration of communion costs God something. Even on the part of God, it is not taken for granted. Even by him, it cannot be achieved with it can only be achieved with labor as a particular event. The heavier the burden of guilt, the heavier the cost, as Luther put it. That is, forgiveness is the very opposite of something which is so natural that it costs no effort. I think that's a partial answer. The real answer is Jesus faces the darkness for you, and he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" because of his love for you. He will bear the cost. He doesn't want you to bear it. And the truth is, I can't bear the cost of even one of my sins. Even one of them I can't make up for it. Even one. Let alone all. So, how does Jesus' darkness, the fact that he faces it, dispel ours? You know, the climax of the gospel is right here. The Gospel of Mark ends, it starts with the statement in the beginning of the gospel, of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then it just hangs that out there until Mark 15, 37 to 39. And this becomes the climax of it all. We finally get the definition. What does it mean for Jesus to be the Son of God? And it comes in this. "And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, 'Truly this man was the Son of God.'" You know, that curtain in the temple, it was not just a thin shower curtain or anything like that. It was almost a half a foot to a foot thick. It was almost like a wall. It was the space between the Holy of Holy Places, the holiest place, and the holy place in the temple. And only once a year, the holiest person, the high priest, who had to sanctify himself through all sorts of rituals, only he, on the holiest day of the year, the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, could take the holiest of sacrifices, the blood of a precious, spotless lamb. And only then, with fear and trepidation, could he alone walk in to the Holy of Holies, even at the time of Jesus, with no Ark of the Covenant there, and he'd sprinkle the blood on a pavement stone that they had in its place there once a year. And now, the temple of the curtain temple was torn in two from top to bottom, just to let you know who did it. Not any human being. That would be bottom to top. The curtain was ripped from top to bottom. And then the Roman centurion of all things. No human being has realized up to this point, no human being has been able to say it and mean it all the way through. Never has Jesus accepted the title Son of God until this moment, when a Roman centurion, a pagan, someone who had seen and been a part of murders and executions, probably a dozen times or more, hundreds of deaths that were in front of him. And this man gets it. Surely this man was the Son of God. Utterly shocking that a Roman would say this. It's really unthinkable. Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, but actually a historian, huge thick book called Dominion. It's worth a read. I've only started it. But he says this about Rome. "So vast had the scope of Roman power become that any man who succeeded in making himself its master, like Caesar, was liable to seem less human than divine. Divinity then was for the very greatest of the great, for victors, heroes, and kings. Its measure was the power to torture one's enemies, not to suffer it oneself, to nail them to the rocks of mountains, or to turn them into spiders, or to blind and crucify them after conquering the world. That a man who had himself been crucified might be hailed as a god could not help but be seen by people everywhere across the Roman world as scandalous, obscene, and grotesque. And yet this Roman centurion gets it. This is what penetrates the darkness for this Roman centurion. This penetrates his cynicism. This penetrated his callousness. This penetrated his whole worldview that power and might make right, and that divinity is only about power and getting things done and doing it my way. Because here, in Jesus, on that cross, he sees an innocent man who does not hate his enemies, does not revile anyone, does not pity himself in any form, but forgives those who are killing him and offers himself up to his Father as a complete, loving sacrifice. A death so shocking and vulnerable that he accepted it willingly, that it melted his callous heart and he saw what God really was all about, hanging dead on the cross for him. The tenderness of Jesus' death pierced his hardness, and the beauty of his death pierced through his darkness. You know, that cross is still scandalous. Makes all the difference. One of the other features I think I need to share with this student who had a very profound question, why would God do this? It wasn't as if Jesus wasn't willing. God didn't do anything to Jesus that Jesus did not accept and willingly suffer. It agonized God. It ripped him apart. The Father grieves over this, and yet the Son willingly gives all for love for you. That's why I think Tom Holland, toward the end of his book, writes this: to be a Christian, then, is to believe that God became man and suffered a death as terrible as any mortal has ever suffered. That is why the cross, that ancient implement of torture, remains what it has always been, the fitting symbol of the Christian revolution. It is the audacity of it, the audacity of finding in a twisted and defeated corpse the glory of the Creator of the universe, that serves to explain more surely than anything else the sheer strangeness of Christianity and of the civilization, and the civilization to which it gave birth. Today, the power of this strangeness remains as alive as it has ever been. It is manifest in the great surge of conversions that have swept Africa and Asia over the past century, in the conviction of millions upon millions that breathe the breath of the Spirit like a living fire still blows upon this world, and in the Europe and North America, in the assumptions of many more millions who would never even think to describe themselves as Christian. All still are heirs to the same revolution, a revolution that has at its molten heart the image of a God dead on the cross. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it.
Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened it to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." You don't turn off the light to get rid of the dark. So why did Jesus have to die? Couldn't the light of the world have found another way? The final cranny of creation that needed to see the light of life was death itself. He had to go to the grave to get his light in the darkest place. The Word made flesh humbled himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. The Creator allowed himself to be killed by the very people he created, and the powers of darkness celebrated. Later, Knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I am thirsty." A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.